My name's Sarah Charles, and I'm a first-year PhD student at Coventry University. I'm studying the psychobiology of social bonding, which means I'm looking at the neurochemistry involved when we are bonding with one another. Human cognitive processes do likely change when people are lonely. There is evidence to suggest that there's a difference in the way certain neural pathways work. We don't know if it's causal, so if one causes the other, but there is definitely a correlation, which means that attention pathways tend to be slightly different. Also, people tend to be more sensitive to kind of punishments or negative stimuli even, and they are less sensitive to reward stimuli. Effects can consist of if it's behavioural effects, you might see someone initially trying to seek contact with other people. You know, if you perceive yourself to be lonely, it might encourage you to get out there. But over time, what might happen is that you are losing, because you're less sensitive to reward and more sensitive to negative stimuli, you might actually be more fearful of seeking contact, which kind of becomes a self-feeding behaviour where you avoid social contact for fear of social rejection and then feel even more lonely. In terms of cognitive processes, you might find someone pays, as I said, you have kind of more attentional awareness to negative stimuli and less attentional awareness to positive ones. So there's been fMRI studies looking at neural pathways suggesting that the way people's attention is focused does change when they're lonely, likely when they're perceiving themselves to be lonely, not necessarily when they are objectively lonely. So someone might be in a crowd of people but feel very lonely, and someone might be by themselves but not feel lonely. Both of them have effects on health. So if you are actually lonely, so if you have fewer social contacts, a smaller social network, especially lower quality social network, your rates of mortality is higher. In fact, I think there was a study, I can't remember the exact year off the top of my head, it might have been 2012, it was a meta-analysis that demonstrated that the odds of mortality is actually somewhere in the region of that of smoking. So the health effects of having low levels of social network or social contact or social support can actually lead to about 50% increase in mortality. In terms of behaviour, you might find that initially people again seek social contact, but then if that isn't rewarded quickly, then they become kind of more isolated in themselves because of the fear of rejection. I can talk about politics, but it's less my area of expertise. I would say that adds a confound to what we are aware of, which is, technology is an interesting one. Technology is a very interesting topic because at the moment, people might feel isolated because of technology. You know, things like social media might be causing people to be experiencing less social contact, having less or lower quality social bonds. So they might have the same number of bonds, possibly more, but the quality of those might be lesser. However, we are still in kind of the early days, is what we might call, of technological social bonding. So there's been a recent study on virtual reality and the use of virtual reality to have people almost dance with others when they are looking at someone through virtual reality, and it allows them to feel far more bonded with that person than if they are out of sync with that person, which mimics real life situations that we're aware of, which means that as virtual reality becomes possibly more widespread, then technology, instead of being a hindrance to loneliness, might actually help people who are lonely to create better bonds with people, who they can meet. I think the term meet space is used on the internet. if they can't go out and meet someone in meet space, they might be able to meet someone and have a fulfilling social engagement in this virtual reality environment. I think that it is definitely a possibility that people feel more isolated because even if they are having conversations, through social media or dating websites and that, actual in-person quality communication, the things that you can get from body language, from moving in time with someone, from laughing along with someone, these are all things that we've found in terms of biochemistry give you a sense of positive reward. And if you're not experiencing that, that can be, it could lead to negative emotions and feelings of loneliness. Deeper levels of communication are really, really kind of the crux of social bonds. So if you have what is called in some parts of the literature social support, the protective factor from social support is assumed to actually be the ability to let you regulate your own emotions better through your social network. So a lot of the problem from an emotion regulation standpoint comes from your rumination or the inability to reappraise the situation and to choose avoidance instead. And it is through those kind of maladaptive or dysfunctional methods of emotion regulation, or it's called emotion dysregulation, might cause a furtherance of negative emotion, whereas having deeper emotional connections or emotional conversations with someone gives you a different avenue to regulate your emotions, and a more positive one, which leads to a lower likelihood. It's not impossible to still have negative feelings, but it's a lower likelihood of propagating negative emotion. There is some evidence, I think, that loneliness is increasing even in young people. Whether or not technology is getting in the way of people stopping this kind of communication may change, as I said, with the advent of virtual reality. So at the moment you are talking through text means, but when you have microphones, when people play online gaming, you find that they actually cite this. People who play massively multiplayer online games, they talk about being in a clan together and being able to vocally speak to one another helps improve their bond with the rest of the group compared to text. And I think with the advent of virtual reality, when you can add movement on top of that, it might increase, again, the level of communication. So we're probably at a tipping point at the moment where at the moment people are suffering from a lack of this kind of communication, but it will lead, potentially, I'm not, not necessarily will, but it's possible that virtuality will usher in this new era of bettering communication, even through kind of the virtual space as opposed to having to meet in person. Technology and technological advancements has absolutely changed the way that we interact with the world, including the number of social contacts we have a day. If you go shopping, I could go shopping and not speak to a single person across 3 shops if I wanted to. I could have headphones in listening to music, pick up my shopping, go to a self-service, and in 10 to 15 years time it could be possible that I have a self-driving car, so that instead of getting the bus or a taxi where I'd have to interact with other people, that wouldn't be the case. So I can imagine technology advancing to a point where we do lower the number of social contacts that we have, which would be negative. It would be probably detrimental in some fashion to our emotional well-being. So having a strong social network or having social contact in general is beneficial to us. So losing that could very well cause problems that we haven't yet considered. In terms of cognitive behavioural aspect of contact, we are looking at, if you want to have the biochemistry, which is what I'm looking at, you've got a hit of probably opioids in the brain giving you this kind of positive feeling, especially if you're laughing together or moving together. You probably have some form of dopamine as well, which is encouraging you or giving you the motivation to do so again sooner. So social contact encourages further social contact, and lacking that stops the motivation for doing so again from happening. Dopamine might be your motivational, kind of the maintenance of these contacts, whereas the endogenous opioids in the brain, they cause that kind of the pleasant feeling that you get from speaking with people, and they're released, especially when you're doing things in time together, working together, that kind of thing. In terms of the way we evolved to be in bands or packs, as it if you to use your terminology. We were hunter-gatherers, and you could see that anthropologists look at modern day hunter-gatherers and they find that they do roam in bands of small groups. And I think Robin Dunbar's work looks at the population sizes of those groups, and you might look at kind of small intimate groups of about 5 people increasing to about 15 people for closer knit groups, and then up to about 50 people for the whole band size. And at the moment, humans are they have come up with technologies to help themselves enhance that even further. And by technology, I don't mean kind of robots or cameras like I'm looking at the moment. I mean dance, language. These are things that allow us to move from smaller bands to larger bands of people. But I think in terms of quality social bonds, you can only have so many. And at the moment we live in a society where I think people are finding it difficult to realise the close-knit groups that they need to have good well-being or mental health and physical health that is provided by a strong social network, because they need to use social media to have 1,000 friends or whatever the number is they seek to have, hundreds of thousands of followers on YouTube or Instagram or any of these major platforms that they feel are part of their social network, but they don't have quality bonds with. In terms of loneliness, which seems to be the focus of a lot of the questions, research is still ongoing. We are aware that being lonely, or even perceiving yourself to be lonely, can have effects on your self-image. I think there was a bit of research done in 2017 where school-aged adolescents found it harder to have an academic self-concept if they felt lonely. You also have kind of attentional pathways being changed by loneliness, or at least influencing loneliness in some way. It could be that the pathways cause the loneliness, or it could be that the loneliness causes the pathways to change. We still don't know. Research is still ongoing, and it's hopefully will help people in the future who are lonely. In terms of my work, I'm looking at kind of what's going on in the brain when bonds are forming or when people are bonding. So almost the opposite of loneliness. And I'm doing that in various ways, partly by going into the field and doing research on people who are already bonding with one another. And I'm also going to be doing some lab studies and encouraging people to bond in a lab setting based on the field research that I'm currently working on. And we're going to be looking at the biochemistry that's happening in the brain whilst that's happening. And I'm hopeful that by understanding the biochemistry of normal social bonding experiences or kind of a regular social bonding experience, we might be able to understand what's going on in the brains of those who aren't able to bond well for various reasons. Depression is one where people lose motivation to bond, or they might feel isolated, so this feeling of loneliness. Autism spectrum disorders have got a social aspect to them, intrinsic to the diagnosis of these, is having either a lack of motivation to bond or an inability to bond. So you have these kind of neuroatypical behaviours that we might be able to learn about through looking at neurotypical behaviours. And that's kind of my aim. Research on loneliness and social support has been going back until the 1980s. But it's only more recently that it's been looked at in a more neuroscientific context, as opposed to a health and stress/adversity beating context. Things that currently have some support but aren't necessarily given by, in this country, the NHS, or in other countries, their health services, would be something like music therapy. Music is a fantastic way of kind of getting the opioid and dopamine system going. People who have strong reactions to music might benefit from what is called music therapy, or something of that ilk. Other people might find sports therapy beneficial. So you have exercise is a very good way of releasing beta endorphins into your bloodstream, into the brain, and lowering or increasing feelings of pleasure, which is what opioids do in the brain. And also it discourages neuroinflammation. So neuroinflammation is when basically the body's immune system is reacting as if you're ill, and if you're ill, your body, your behaviour tends to kind of retreat. You lose motivation for social activities, and so activity like sports, or going for a run, doing even in your bedroom, if you can't go for runs because you've got a knee problem, you could do sit-ups or push-ups or planking or whatever might be considered physical activity that gets your heart rate going. If you could do that with a meetup group, there are people who do running on meetup.com or something like that, and if you can do it in a group, then you actually get an even stronger benefit from that. And that could help reduce loneliness. There's new sports like climbing. I think there's climbing wall not far from here in Coventry. There's, I think, more opening up more recently. They are also very, very good at creating a communal atmosphere, because obviously only one person can be climbing on a specific part of the wall at once, so other people are watching and supporting that person. And again, that might reduce loneliness. With shops closing, high street shops closing, because online shopping is more convenient for many. If you don't have the time to, if you're at work, you've got a 15-minute break, it's easier to pop on your computer or your phone and quickly order something and have it delivered to your home when you're going to be there, than it is to take time out of your day to go to the shops and buy the same thing. Obviously, that means that we are interacting with other shoppers less, other people who are salespeople in their shops less. We are losing that kind of contact, and I can understand that can feel isolating for some people. I am hopeful for the future that things like virtual reality, early signs suggest that it could be beneficial in creating better forms of social contact in a virtual space, because technology is moving us to a virtual space. That is, an undeniable fact, that more and more people are spending more and more time in the virtual space, be it on social media, watching TV at home instead of going to cinemas. You might well have, something like a streaming service, Hulu, Netflix, HBO, all of those things. They can be watched from the comfort of your own bedroom. You don't even need to see another human being. Whereas if you go to the cinema to watch a film, you need to go and buy a ticket. Even then, you might have self-service, but there'll be other people around you in the cinema, hopefully. And again, that's a form of social contact that we're losing out on. So I can definitely understand the question being, with these shops disappearing, with this level of contact disappearing, will that affect us negatively? And I think in the short term, yes. In the long term, I think we will come up with ways of bettering our social contact in the virtual space. If we look at America, where you've got a massive opioid crisis going on at the moment, and that in part comes from a prescription problem, because we don't have it in Europe so much, but it is also possibly being caused by a massive shift in the way society is structured, so that we are not experiencing social bonds. The opioid epidemic is killing many people in America at the moment, and it's very sad. And I'm hoping that changes to the prescription systems and the societal outlook will help change that. But I think one good way to change that would be to help with social contact, because one thing that we notice is those who lose social contact suffer with similar withdrawal symptoms to those who have withdrawal symptoms from opioids. And that's why, initially in the 1970s and 1980s, people made the link between endogenous opioids and social bonding. And it's that kind of research which I'm following up on. I'm still early on in my research, so I'm still in the data collection part of my early studies. But I'm hopeful that we will be able to understand the role of behavioural synchrony in the bonding process. It's already relatively well established that being synchronous with other people improves bonding, but we don't know whether this is like an on-off thing, or if there's some kind of spectrum of level of synchronicity or behavioural synchrony, I should say. So I'm hoping that my research can help understand the behavioural mechanisms helping bonding, but also looking at the biochemistry, so looking at endorphins, looking at dopamine, looking at other neurochemicals that could play a role, and shining a light on that, so that we can help those who suffer with maladaptive social bonding, or not maladaptive social bonding, but social bonding deficits, I should say. So, as I said before, depression leading to a distinct lack of social motivation, or by borderline personality disorder also has similar social dysfunction in terms of the bonding process is dysfunctional in some way. I'm hopeful that by the end of the PhD, my work could help those help those studying social bonding, give a basis for further research, highlighting the importance of one neurochemical over another. Can't come to any conclusions yet, that's what the research is for, and also help those researching in neuroatypical people and help them have a better starting point for researching certain symptoms. I don't know anyone who's currently looking at making infographics or a visual representation of this work, but I can't imagine anyone would be against that idea. If in the future we were to be approached by someone who had the skills to design such an infographic, or who had the capability to present the information that we have in an easily digestible visual form, then that would be wonderful. The kind of spread of information is always positive if you can do so in a clear, concise and accurate way. In the brain, reward pathways and Berridge and colleagues have produced a lot of work looking at these reward pathways, and so in the media there's a lot of stuff talking about dopamine, but the research by Berridge and colleagues suggests that the dopamine aspect of the reward pathways is kind of the wanting, the motivational aspect of it. So wanting to repeat the behaviour, giving you an incentive to do something. They call it incentive salience in their writing. So you're making something salient means like it's more present than other things, and it's obviously incentive. So dopamine gives you this kind of like, this, I want to do this more. Whereas the opioid pathways tend to be the rewarding, pleasurable feeling, which is, which might even be seen in the difference in the way kind of narcotics users behave compared to those who take dopamine-based drugs. So cocaine, for example, is a dopamine-based drug, and these people have hyperactive attention. They are, lots of things become things that they want to do because they have this hyperactive incentive salience. Whereas people who take, morphine or heroin, or they have other opioid addictions, they don't have this heightened sense of desire to do things. They just have a sense of euphoria initially, and then just possibly a sense of serenity. When in lower doses, so instead of being completely euphoric, it might just be serenity, where they're not feeling low as opposed to feeling purely high. And just understanding that this difference allows us to look at reward pathways from bonding as well. So you have to have, it is likely that both of those neurochemicals, dopamine and opioids, play their own role, but we don't yet know the exact role that they play. People's living conditions is absolutely linked to their well-being. That is, I would find it difficult to believe that, being in a worse situation doesn't lead to worse outcomes on average. There are exceptions to that rule, but if you are in a setting where you have low social contact, you are living paycheck to paycheck because you have not got the money to afford to save or anything like that, so you're worried, you're anxious about paying rent, you don't have time to see people in a social context because you're working too much to do so, or you're too tired to do so, these things will absolutely affect people's well-being. Whether or not that can be changed is a matter for people in other fields than me to deal with. Thank you for listening. I hope you've found what I've said at least mildly interesting, and please do go away and read some of the literature that I'm talking about, because it is interesting, and at least to me, and I think important for people to understand the role of having both quantity and quality social bonds.